Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Friday, June 18th, 2021 edition of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, we have our first Democratic candidate for governor. Another Democrat is seriously thinking about running for Congress in the 1st District. And our current governor signs a couple of big bills into law. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for Lee Enterprises. With me today are Amie Rivers of the Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier. Good morning, Amie.
Good morning, Erin.
And also Gazette columnist Todd Dorman. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning.
And as a reminder for you all, you can subscribe to the On Iowa Politics podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. First up this week, we know that Governor Kim Reynolds will be largely, if not entirely, unchallenged in the Republican primary when she runs for re-election as expected next year. Now we know for certain that she will not be unchallenged in the general election either. Not that we ever thought that she might. The first Iowa Democrat has officially declared candidacy, and it is Waterloo state lawmaker Roz Smith. Amie, over there in Waterloo, you reported on Smith's campaign announcement. What did he have to say about the kind of candidate that he hopes to be?
Well, we're just excited that we got somebody from Waterloo that's in the news finally over here. Yay! What was the last time we had a governor from Waterloo? That'd be interesting. I bet Todd knows. He'll tell me. But yeah, so, I mean, Roz is, a state representative. He was basically, after Deb Berry stepped down, longtime state representative here in his majority Democratic district. He ran. He actually did get a Republican opponent, but pretty well beat him handily with like 63% of the vote. And then since then has been unchallenged. He was elected in 2016, unchallenged in 2018, unchallenged in 2020. So it's going to be really interesting to see if he can parlay what is basically an anointment year after year into actually getting into what will definitely be a competitive race for governor. So that'll be really interesting. His campaign, was very much bridging the gaps. So yes, I have a background in farming. Yes, I have, the rural roots as well as the urban roots. Grew up on the east side of Waterloo, still live here with my family. So really trying to, put together a general election candidacy kind of thing. It will be really interesting to see if once more Democrats get in the field, which we're almost certain that they will, where he sort of sets himself in that ranking among the Democrats. So that'll be what I'm watching for going forward.
Thanks, Amie. And to those who picked up on that, we're past the pandemic and folks are back in the newsroom, and that's why you could hear some chatter behind Amie there. Todd, as Amie noted, obviously Smith will not be the only Democrat to run for governor. There almost certainly will be a competitive primary here. Obviously, without knowing for sure who else will run, I mean, we know some possibilities, but as of right now, we don't know for sure. Just kind of looking at Roz Smith, what kind of chances do you give him? Can he be the type of candidate who can be a serious competitor in a Democratic primary?
I think so, just because he's well regarded in the party. I mean, people like him. They like what he's done in the legislature. They appreciate the leadership he's provided. So, I mean, it'll all depend on, how his campaign progresses. If he goes out and delivers a good message that Democrats want to hear, and brings out some policy proposals that are attractive to primary voters, I think they're willing to give him a listen. And I think, he has plenty of upside if he turns out, if his campaign progresses in a positive way. I mean, we don't know how many people are going to run, but chances are there will be some formidable opponents. But I don't know that there's anyone I can think of that might run that would just, sort of end the discussion. I think there are candidates that could win and that would do well, but I think Roz Smith, can hang with those candidates, and it may be, a closer primary than we think. I don't know how many candidates are going to get in. We could have as few as 3 or 4, and as many as 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there. But I think Roz Smith is definitely part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I agree with and I made these points in a little piece I wrote for the weekend. I mean, he's been at the front of some important issues at the legislature. So while he may not have a statewide profile, um, first of all, I don't know how many Democrats do, so that doesn't necessarily put him behind an eight ball. And he's been at the forefront of their racial and social justice legislation, and he's also been big on education. So he's on the younger side. Maybe that helps him present
Yeah.
a contrast. It'll be interesting.
It's hard to run out of the legislature for governor, but it's been done. I think, when Tom Vilsack ran in '98, I in the beginning I thought, Mark McCormick was probably former Supreme Court justice was probably the front runner, but you know, like Roz Smith, Vilsack had a compelling personal story and was good on the stump, and you know basically built that campaign and had a lot of help from the public sector labor unions were kind of what carried him over the top. But so you can run out of the legislature even if you're not known statewide. Especially now with social media and all the tools we have, you can get known fairly quickly.
Yeah. All right. Obviously, one to watch, and not only Roz alone, but as we've noted, to see who else gets involved in that Democratic primary in the coming weeks and months. Moving on to another 2022 election, Cedar Rapids area Democratic state lawmaker Liz Mathis said this week that she is giving serious thought to running for Congress in Eastern Iowa's 1st District. Now, this is putting the cart in front of the horse here, but if Mathis were to happen to secure the Democratic nomination and run against freshman Republican incumbent Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, that would be an election race between two former TV news journalists who worked at the same Cedar Rapids station, KCRG with TV, which is just crazy. So my first question actually is to both Todd and Amie. Which one of you will be the first to announce your intention to leave journalism and run for office?
Todd.
Yeah, I don't think I will be doing that. I may be leaving journalism at some point, but that'll just be involuntary. I mean, I won't be going to run.
Can I just say,
for
Todd
something.
has really been laying the groundwork for a race on Twitter. I mean, we've all seen it.
Yeah, I've been laying the groundwork for scandals. So,
What's the difference?
Yeah, right. You should fit right in then. All right. So Todd, let me ask you first here. In all seriousness, so again, Mathis, a very highly regarded state legislature, she does have good name recognition in her area for the previously discussed reasons. If she jumps into this 1st District race, my question to you is: does that clear the Democratic primary field? Does a Liz Mathis candidacy scare off all other Democrats?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think she, as you said, is well known and well regarded, and has been mentioned numerous times for running for something bigger than the state senate. Uh, yeah, she's going to be a formidable candidate. I mean, and of all the candidates the Democrats could have picked to go up against Ashley Hinson, this would probably be number one on their list. I mean, because of her name recognition, and you know she's as adept at being telegenic, I guess, is whatever the word would be, as Hinson is. So yeah, that would be a really interesting race.
Amie, you're based in the 1st District, although Mathis's State House district isn't in your coverage area, obviously. But if she ran for Congress, that'd be in your area there. Do you have any initial thoughts on Mathis's potential, kind of, I'd even dare say, likely candidacy?
Yeah, I think it's looking increasingly likely that she's going to be running. She's meeting with people like Cindy Axne. She's talking with the newspapers and things like that. I mean, she's laying more of a groundwork than Todd would be if he was running, basically. But it's really interesting because they're on paper almost the exact same candidate, right? With their backgrounds both in broadcast journalism, they literally worked at the same TV station at the same time. Basically, they were both in the state legislature and now are going for the same race. So it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, you're going to find political differences, but just looking at their background, that's a big thing to people. Have I seen them before? Do I trust them on the news? And that trust can, engender itself in other ways, like in politics. So I think that'll be one of Liz Mathis' strengths if she decides to run, and that'll be really one of the interesting things to watch. Will it be a battle of the TV station, former reporters, anchors, whatnot, have you? And it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, and Mathis has a kind of, she's from a sort of swingy Senate district where I happen to be sitting right now. I'm in her district, and I can look out the window and tell you it's kind of swingy. So so she has a somewhat kind of a moderate profile as a legislator. I mean, she's not when she, after the news broke that she was considering it, I think some Republicans took a fairly lame swing at her, trying to call her socialist Liz Mathis or something, which I think to her constituents and the people that know her is kind of laughable, because she's not exactly AOC. I mean, she's, she worked at Four Oaks, which is a child welfare organization, and has, done various things after her TV career. But so yeah, I mean, if Representative Henson's last campaign is any indication, there's going to be lots of that. You want to defund the police, and you're a socialist, and you want to, the Green New Deal and no more ethanol, and it's going to be a little bit tougher to make that sort of stuff stick on Liz Mathis, I think. But I'm doubtless they'll try.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Todd, and I would agree. I think, in reality, that's a tough sell to make. What you're describing there, how the Republicans would try to brand Liz Mathis. Now, that said, as we all know all too well, campaigns are not always conducted in reality.
and they're not conducted in reality at all anymore, to some extent.
so it'll be interesting to see if they kind of continue to try to slap that label on Liz Mathis, and then B, whether it sticks. I agree. The evidence will be tough to mount, but some of those campaign ads don't really care a whole lot about evidence. So we'll see how that goes. And to circle back on the original question, we'll see if Liz Mathis does run, if she does indeed kind of clear that field. I would tend to agree. It sure, and I'll tell you what else, Todd. And let me run this by you really quick. We had heard whispers that if Abby Finkenauer, who held this seat before losing to Ashley Hinson in the recent election, if she was thinking about doing anything, maybe she was thinking about running for the Senate. I would assume that this budding Liz Mathis news kind of indicates to us that Abby Finkenauer is not considering running for re-election in the 1st district, or trying to run again, I should say, in the 1st district, because I would assume that if she was, that Liz Mathis would not be considering this. Do you think, is that a fair kind of?
I think that's probably, I think that's probably right. Once Abby sort of talked about maybe running for the Senate, then you see this Mathis thing come after that. And so I think that's how the dominoes are kind of falling.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, we'll be watching those dominoes and talking about them in future episodes. Finally, this week, get into actual governing off the campaign trail here. Governor Kim Reynolds this week signed into law a couple of pretty big bills that were passed during the legislative session. One tax reform bill that included approximately $1 billion things in it. So I won't go through all of them here, but the big ones, an income tax cut and shifting mental health care funding from local property taxes to the state. And then she also, the next day, signed the so-called Back the Blue bill, which adds some legal protections for law enforcement officials. Amie, the tax bill, again, I said about $1 billion things. It also included that phase out of the property tax backfill for local governments. We talked about that on last week's podcast. You wrote a great story about it. Folks, if you missed it, should go check that out. But I wanted to ask you about the shift in mental health care funding from local property taxes to the state. That was a very popular provision. Bipartisan support, advocates and stakeholders really like that, and there were a bunch of them at the bill signing ceremony. There was some hesitation, though, from Democratic lawmakers about kind of a concern about the future of funding now, because now mental health care funding is in that big state budget pie, and it's got to compete every year with everything else. Did you talk to Cedar Valley Democrats? How did they feel about that shift of mental health care funding to the state?
They're cautiously optimistic is probably the best way to put it. You're right that it's popular, and the caveat is it's popular if it's funded and if it keeps being funded. So because it's tied to this property tax backfill thing that's going away, which was also something that was popular as long as it was funded, they're wary, right? So they're saying if you can just take that away, you could take this away. And it's not without precedent, obviously. And so that's the wariness. Yes, it would probably be good if there was a dedicated state fund that equally dispersed money to where it's needed, especially to pick up the slack in places of the state where they don't have the money to fund mental health. And it's such a crisis. You can't keep doing the same thing you're doing and expect the same results. So change in that sense is good. And I think that Democrats are a little bit optimistic. People like Representative Tammy Brown Powers, who actually works in healthcare, keep saying, though, you need to fund this. This needs to be adequately funded and going into the future being funded, because otherwise it's going to become another unfunded mandate that will actually make our pretty horrible mental health care system in the state even worse. So I think that's what they're really wary about.
Todd, what's your level of confidence in future legislatures to adequately fund mental health care services now that it's up to the state?
Well, all you need to do is ask your local school superintendent. We have the same system to fund public schools, and that hasn't worked out so hot for them. And yesterday, when she signed the bill, the tax bill, she didn't say, and next year we're going to look at more funding. She said, next year we're going to cut taxes even lower. So this idea that the state's taken over the system, which is expensive and has never been adequately funded, and now they're talking about more tax cuts. I'm not hopeful, that they're going to be doing much beyond the, an inflationary budget increase, which is not going to get the job done.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and that's exactly what. So, the governor fielded questions from reporters after that bill signing, and I asked her about exactly that, Todd, because I had the same reaction. Okay, you're adding things to the state budget, and then proposing to take more revenue out of the state budget. So how can those two things still work going forward? And she said, we'll do our projections and blah blah blah. But I think that's the that's the concern. I think that you raise a very valid point that we're making the pie bigger, but with fewer ingredients, I think is maybe the analogy there.
Yeah.
So Todd, I also mentioned the Back the Blue bill, and setting aside the contents of it, and some of those were popular and some were contentious. The other discussion here I wanted to ask you about is over how the bill attempts to address police safety, but does not in any way address the other half of the societal equation that our country is grappling with right now, and that's racial and social justice. After passing landmark legislation in 2020, Republican majorities in the Iowa legislature this year didn't even hold a hearing on any racial and social justice bills, much less advance them and get one to the governor. Todd, is that the new direction for the Iowa GOP? Are they just going to focus on police protections and ignore calls for further police reforms like the anti-racial profiling bills out there? Or is there a chance that those Republican majorities come back next year and tackle that other side of the ledger?
It's possible, but it's doubtful. The Republicans in the legislature, as we've seen a lot of times, they have sort of a nationalized agenda. They're doing things that other red states are doing. They're doing things that Donald Trump did. And last summer, immediately after George Floyd was killed at the hands of police, there was a moment where there was some bipartisan agreement that something had to be done. This was a particularly egregious case. Maybe there are changes that could be made. But as the summer went on, and and that was when the legislature passed what it passed, and the governor signed it. It was unanimous, 150 to nothing. But then during the summer, the president, then Donald Trump, started to depict these protests as like an existential threat to democracy, and they were going to march into the suburbs, and these are Black Lives Matter or Marxists, and so the tone changed, and they began to sort of demonize the protesters and turn them into a political cudgel to beat Democrats who were more sympathetic to the protests. So, and I think the Iowa GOP sort of made that transition also. I mean, I remember immediately after Reynolds signed the bill, there already started to be some criticism of her on Republican websites and social media that she had thrown in with Black Lives Matter and they're Marxists and this was a bad idea. And so Donald Trump ran against these protests. It became a law and order campaign. And I think when the Republicans, swept the victories they did in Iowa, they decided they were going to continue to follow that sort of law and order playbook. And I mean, that's how we got to today. And I'm doubtful they'll take up any of the issues that the social justice movement is hoping for. It's a pretty remarkable turnaround from watching that Sonny Bill signing on the steps last year with, Black Lives Matter and NAACP and all those folks around, to yesterday when she's just flanked by ranks of law enforcement officers as she signed the Back the Blue bill. It was a very different visual.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point you make about the campaign and the direction. I mean, if I were a betting man, I would tend to agree, Todd, because it's not only did they go out and turn that into a campaign issue, they reminded anybody who was willing to listen of that repeatedly throughout the session. When anybody would ask them, including journalists would ask, okay, you're doing, police protections. Are you also going to do police reform? The answer was always some version of, hey, we went out and campaigned on Back the Blue and protecting the police, and that's what we're here to do. That doesn't sound to me like a group of folks that are planning to make any sort of varying off of that path that they've set themselves on. We'll see. They've got a chance to prove us wrong next year, but we'll see. My hunch is the same read as yours, Todd. Well, that's it for this week's edition of On Iowa Politics. We thank you all for listening, and we hope it was worth your time. If you like the show, subscribe and tell a friend. You can send fan mail to oniowapolitics@gmail.com. And don't forget the work of everyone you heard here today, and as well as those who couldn't be with us, can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier, Sioux City Journal, Mesa City Globe Gazette, Muscatine Journal, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and Cedar Rapids Gazette. Euforquestra will play us out this week. If you know a talented band or Iowa musician who should be featured on our show, send us a sound file. We'd love to play it. For Amie, Todd, and our producer, Steven, I'm Erin Murphy. Thanks for listening.
Tonight. Ooh. what you put into that soup. And they said, ooh, what you put into that soup. She cooks that soup, she locks her house up so tight to keep all the ladies out and to make that soup to taste so right.